is the paraset on the left, which was designed for use by the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS. We think probably about 1938-39. What preceded it were boxes of, excuse me, hernia. Boxes of radios, that sort of size and that sort of weight, which secret agents were expected to carry around in Europe with the Gestapo looking for such people. Not a good prospect. That is one of a pair of boxes which were also available in 1939. That's the transmitter side, and the receiver was about the same size. Both pretty heavy and very hard to conceal. And as to concealing these radios, God help you. But they were obviously pretty effective radios in terms of transmission. That, we think, is probably the prototype of the paraset. That's held in the collection in Kent by a man called Winnie, Elgar Winnie, and I photographed that about a year ago. For those that know the paraset and know something about it, you can see the resemblances immediately, except that it's big and clumsy and no way you could conceal it. The story is that somebody was told, take that prototype and put it into a metal cash box, sort of thing that's used in an office, and that's how the paraset evolved. Well, here are the players in SOE, the Special Operations Executive, SOE. They were created just after the start of the war, when it looked like Hitler was going to come across the Channel and be unstoppable. And Churchill had just been made Prime Minister of Britain, and he told the person who was responsible for secret warfare, set Europe ablaze, set fire to it. And that was really the operating instruction of SOE, to come into Europe and make trouble for the German army as far as possible. Two interesting people in this picture. Bottom left is Leo Marx, who was the man who developed codes for the agents in SOE. He wrote a wonderful book called From Silk to Cyanide. I doubt if it's in Norwegian, but if you've got enough English to read a book, it's a very entertaining book, wonderful book. He really tells the truth about what happened in a military operation during warfare. And on the right is a young woman called Violette Sabo. Her real name was Violette Bushell. She was British. Her mother was French. She married a Hungarian Frenchman who was killed at El Alamein, and she decided that she was going to do something about it, and she volunteered, went to SOE, was sent into Europe, and was captured the second time around. And I won't tell you the rest of the story because it's very depressing.
I talked to one guy from Norway in a SOE company called Company Linge.
Yes, yes.
And Elder Hagen, he was in love with her.
Everybody was in love with her. Leo Marx was in love with her.
Everyone.
And he wrote this poem for someone else, but he finished up giving it to her. We'll show you. These are the two books that, if you are able to read them and find them, well, do so, because they're very interesting indeed. This is the poem he wrote. Do you want me to read it out to you?
Yeah.
Sure.
The life that I have is all that I have, and the life that I have is yours. The love that I have of the life that I have is yours and yours and yours. A sleep I shall have, a rest I shall have, yet death will be but a pause, for the peace of my years in the long green grass will be yours and yours and yours. Now, the reason that she was given that poem was that at that stage in the war, they were using poems to create their codes from. And remembering a poem that the Germans wouldn't recognize immediately was very difficult. Marx used to get them to compose their own poems, and some of them were really filthy. But they'd remember them, and that was incredibly important. Didn't want to have anything written down, you just got to remember it, so that it couldn't be winkled out of you by the Gestapo. So that's why she was given that poem, and she said she could remember it, and she did so in about 5 minutes, because it sort of rang a bell, I think, with her, because she lost her husband. I'm sorry, this machine is terribly slow. Now, the other book for a radio amateur is fascinating. Pierre Lokalene, Secret Warfare, if you can get it, incredibly scarce. I found one about 20 years ago in a second-hand shop. It's by an architect, and I'm an architect, so it really appeals. He draws beautiful drawings in pencil, and no photographs.
Do you have a print of these references, book references? They're gone out of my head as soon as I flash off the screen.
I can provide you with a book list and references through Tori. We're in communication.
Yeah.
Here's the original Paraset. Again, this was a radio designed for SIS about 1940 to try and overcome the problem of huge radios for agents going into Europe and trying to move around without being caught. Problem is that it is incredibly crude. The transmitter's okay. It uses a 6v6, simple self-regenerative oscillator like the set that Tori's building. The receiver is horrible. It uses two SK7s. It's a TRF. It simply operates with a simple detector tube followed by an audio amplifier, two SK7s. Now the problem is, in order to receive continuous wave Morse, you have to have the receiver oscillating. And what's the most crazy thing to be doing in occupied Europe is to have an oscillating receiver which can be heard by the Gestapo's vans which go around listening all the time. So that was almost a death sentence in France. Quite a lot of them came to Norway because you have the advantage of geography to help you. They've got a lot of wilderness, places that you can hide, which in France is not as easy. So there quite a lot came here. In the metal boxes were better than in the wooden boxes because the signal was contained within the metal enclosure. But the wooden ones were very unpleasant to use indeed. Now these are pictures from Pierre Lokalen's book. The pictures describe the Paraset, and you can see his drafting. He's quite a good architect to be drawing wirelesses, I think. And that's the circuit. And again, those of you who understand valve radio will see immediately how incredibly simple it is. A single stage for the transmitter, which was reasonably stable because it used a crystal, and the two valves for the receiver, producing this horrible receiver, which works. It works. I've used it, but it's not something I'd recommend anybody to use. That's the first collection of components I made, half of which finished up being jettisoned. And that's the panel layout of this radio. This material is all on the internet. There's more information on the internet than you can imagine. I collected that much thickness of paper before I started work on mine, because there are all sorts of people who built them. There's a guy in Sweden who's very, very efficient, produced beautiful drawings, beautiful descriptions. It's the best site. There's a gentleman in Italy who's produced lots of pictures and very little description. I prefer the Swedish side myself. The key, which you can see.
Not there. In the.
Oh yeah, in your transmitter.
Yes.
Can I pass that around?
Yes.
Because that's interesting. That tiny little Morse key is made out of Perspex acrylic, and very tiny, but it works okay. Now here's some pictures of the genuine Paraset, and you can see the key top left, which is the one you'll see in Tori's little radio. there's the one I made. I made mine in a rather old-fashioned sort of way with a solid bar of brass. But I built another one which is closer to the real thing. The slow motion drive for the tuning's an interesting exercise. And coil winding's also interesting. And that's what my paraset looked like in the early stage before wiring it up. I bet there are people with sharp enough eyes to see the mistake that I made in building this set. Hands up who can tell.
Nice.
It's the capacitors.
It's on nomination box.
I misread the illustrations, and those capacitors are 150 picofarad rather than 100. So they're about that much too long. And of course it threw tuning and everything out, and it took me a long time to discover why. The real thing... That radio's got the right capacitor in it. Pass that one around, Tori. Those are paraset size capacitors. 100 puff.
What is this? This is not a paraset.
No. It's fantasy set.
Fantasy set? Tormo set?
Yes.
Highly desirable. In 50 years' time, they'll be fighting for bids for that one. That's the paraset wire.
First time I tried it, on the air, I got an answer from London.
Very appropriate.
Yes.
Very appropriate.
And he was using 2 watts QRP also.
Det är ju ganska stor första toa.
Nice radio. Anyway, that's the inside of my
Ja,
paraset.
ja, riktigt.
And that's
De har väl sett det.
as it was finished. And I stuck it into a suitcase, and I decided that I didn't really like that. That first version of the paraset finished up in this suitcase, and I decided that I really liked the look of the metal case ones better. So after about 6 months I started to make metalwork. And I put it off for a long time because it's sheet metal, and I don't know if any of you tried working sheet metal, but it's quite difficult because it's very stiff. It's not like aluminium. But fortunately, years ago, I bought this pan brake press, this device for bending sheet metal, and that will handle 1 millimetre sheet steel quite well. But I wouldn't like to do it any other way. Cutting it up was a problem. I had to use a saw, an electric saw, with one of these plunger type saws, and then finish it off with a file. And then how do you put it together? Screws aren't any good because it was actually put together using spot welding. Finally, I found someone in Australia, in Sydney, who had a spot welder, and he did it in 5 minutes. Incredible. I was going to solder it. The solder strap around the edge of the box, which seals it up, took me about half an hour to put on, compared with the spot welding taking 5 minutes. It's absolutely ridiculous. So there it is in its metal box. And after a while, I thought, well, it's not quite perfect. I mean, it had sort of little defects. I'm not going to tell you about them because they're not obvious. But to somebody who spent a lot of time reading about parasets, it was enough to suggest that I ought to try and do another one which was better. So, what else is this?
Black box, like
No,
need nothing.
I have a horrible feeling it may be something to do with the problems we had to start off with.
You should have a picture of your wife there. Every amateur needs an understanding wife.
You had Olof förut.
I'm afraid I don't know what happened there. That's been eliminated. So, when I got this urge to do another paraset, I put the old one, the first one, into a wooden box, which is very much like the set that was used in Norway by Olaf Frid Olsen. And I could show you a picture of the one that's in the the Imperial War Museum in London, but I assure you it's very similar. So that was one thing to do to keep myself busy. This is the new paraset, and you can see this time, or maybe you can't, I used an aluminium sheet for the top panel in the first one, which of course is crazy because there was an aluminium sheet around in 1943. This one uses steel, so it hasn't been finished yet, but that's the stage it got to just before I left to come overseas. The other things that are interesting and apply to Norway are this sort of set, which is the MCR1, the Miniature Communications Receiver, and that used valves that you would be very familiar with, 1T4, 3V4, 1S5, and so on, and they are, again, valves of the size used in that little radio that Torres put together. And that's my endeavour to make a replica of this radio, and let's pass that around, because that was designed by a Norwegian, Willy Simonsen. Is that the way to pronounce it?
Willy Simonsen.
Perfect.
He was a member of this club.
Yeah, well, I think it's an admirable little radio. It uses 3 1T4s. It doesn't have a transformer. It runs off a 4.5 volt battery, which was used on bicycle lamps, and an HT battery, which would last for a fairly long time because it didn't have an output transformer. It was all resistance coupled, very efficient. And anyway, that's the stage mine got to before I came overseas. So Mr. Churchill had a few things to say after El Alamein, which is probably appropriate. I quote, "The Germans have received back again that measure of fire and steel which they have so often meted out to others. Now this is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." Well, he's right, wasn't he? 1947, I was extraordinarily lucky because when my father bought that radio, what I didn't know, and I hope you probably do know, is that it used a horrible system that they have in England, AC-DC. Hot chassis, no transformer. Absolutely suicidal. And the suicidal bit is me aged about 12, drilling a hole in the case and putting in an earphone connection. Now fortunately, and I didn't know how fortunate I was, I connected it to the outside connections of the coil, the output coil for the output transformer for the loudspeaker. So I was sort of protected from anything that might go wrong in that radio. But it's an absolute death trap. And if any of you have anything to do with British radios, that's the first thing to check. Has it got a transformer? Because a huge number of them didn't. And I don't know how many people have been killed, but there must have been quite a lot. Because if you switch it round the wrong way, and a lot of cables were equipped with bayonets to go into lights, and it was just too easy to twist it the wrong way around, so you had a hot chassis rather than a cold chassis. Just be very careful.
Philips used that principle, you know. We call them universal receivers.
Yeah, universally crazy.
Yeah.
Urører?
Yeah.
And I leave you with this, which is the famous photograph of the first transistor, which was really a diode with an extra whisker. And the radio that came out of it, the first portable, the little TR1 made by Texas. And that was the start of an entirely new era, which I don't think, and I suspect you're all that interested in, given all of the valve radios I can see. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay.
That's it.
you very much, Peter. I got some small gifts for you as a token of our gratitude. I have some spares for your paraset,
Oh, thank you very much.
brand new.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. And some reprints of some wireless sets, and some reprints we made from Norwegian catalogs.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for your talk.
This is where having a very forgiving wife is incredibly important, because with the luggage constraints on weight flying back to Australia, this is going into her baggage. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a piece of pure silicon I want to give you.
Oh,
I looked into my collection and found some pure silicon pieces, so I think that's kind of used in the crystals
Oh,
radio
yes,
and
yeah.
also in the transistors.
Oh, that's galena.
Yeah.
Galena?
Yeah.
Silver lead.
Yeah.
Yes, used in cat's whisker.
Yeah.
Yes, galena.
Mm.
This is semiconductor.
Okay.
Thank you very much.